I'm John Banther, and this is Classical Breakdown. From Classical WETA in Washington, we take you behind the music. In this episode, I'm joined by Classical WETA's James Jacobs, and we're talking about a kind of work that almost every composer has tried writing, the concerto. We talk about its origins and humble beginnings, its development through Mozart, and the star-studded height of its fame in the Romantic period of the 19th century. Also, stay with us to the end to find out which instrument in the orchestra was the last to get a concerto. I like to imagine, James, and think back to when certain things were invented. What was it like? What was the process? And thinking about the concerto, I imagine hundreds of years ago, there was a group of musicians. They performed together and play, and they get together for a rehearsal, and one of the musicians pulls out some new music and says, "Hey, I got a new piece here. Let's read through it." And they start playing it, and some of the other musicians start looking at each other, and they stop, and it's like, well, wait a second. Why is your part so much cooler than ours? And why are you sitting in front of us? Do you think you're better than us? I feel like there was some kind of argument maybe at the beginning here with the first concerto.
I think so. Well, of course, there's also solos in church choir, right? And there's all sorts of, why does, in Shakespeare's time, why does Hamlet get 4,000 lines and we get 2? It's
That's a good point.
Yeah, it's there's always that sense of there's always hierarchy. One guy has always got to just keep on going, and while the rest of the people just play the whole notes. Yeah, I don't know.
So I think we're all familiar with the idea of a concerto. Often we say that and we think of a big orchestra and a star violinist at the front of the stage, but the concerto has more humble beginnings, doesn't it? I'm thinking of in the Baroque period in like the 1600s with these early concertos, for instance by Giuseppe Torelli, many of them for the trumpet. They're fantastic, and the trumpet was used because it was able to project more and fill a bigger space as a soloist, but these are like 5-6 minutes long sometimes. The solo part isn't some big developed statement or anything like that. It had a very, very humble beginning.
Yeah, and I think if an instrument plays by itself, it sounds kind of lonely. Whereas if an instrument plays accompanied by a few people where there's, as we were talking about, a definite hierarchy of what's important, but the other instruments create this sort of sonic backdrop to make that one person really shine, then well, that's exciting for the listener, and it's very gratifying for that one-star soloist. And as we have discussed, it also creates lots of envy in all those other musicians.
So the concerto is, it's blossoming, it's coming to fruition, and one big composer, right, to really push it forward was Antonio Vivaldi. He lived from 1678 to 1741, and he wrote hundreds of concertos, hundreds for the violin, also for bassoon and for the lute, and several pretty impressive ones for the oboe. And I feel like with these, it's a good example when you hear it. You have a very clear definition between the soloist and the accompaniment, and the soloist is a bit more involved than some of those early Torelli concertos.
Now, Vivaldi was a very prolific composer, and one of the things that he wrote most of, actually, was operas. I mean, that's really how he made his bread and butter, was writing operas. That's how everybody did in the early 18th century. And so what Vivaldi did was transfer that same sense of event that you heard from hearing a really great singer sing an aria to hearing a really great instrumentalist hearing a concerto. And so as a result, he wrote over 200 concertos just for the violin, which was his own instrument. But what was really extraordinary is how he put shine on all these other instruments, including the oboe, which is probably at the time that I would say the second most important orchestral instrument after the violin in terms of what really carried the melody.
And I like that point about operas, because there's that dramaticism on stage, and Vivaldi is bringing it to more economical means, one of a few musicians, but also more available to many people, where if you have a big production as opposed to a concert with a couple of concertos, he's bringing that dramaticism from the stage into this smaller format.
Oh, absolutely. It's basically like an opera in 10 minutes. I mean, you have you have this dramatic build-up by the orchestra, and then the soloist comes in, and there's, and the soloist, shows off, plays the melody, and then shows off certain, all this technical virtuosity around that melody, and then there's a poignant slow movement in which you have an emotional moment and lyricism, and then a dance-like finale. So you get this whole world in about 10 minutes. All plus you get to admire, it's like being at the Olympics. So you get to admire the athleticism and virtuosity of the soloist, and it's got everything. It's just this great self-contained entertainment. And Vivaldi knew they had a good thing when he stumbled onto it, because he wrote over 500 concertos.
And we also have in the Baroque period something called a Concerto Grosso. So what is the difference between a concerto and a Concerto Grosso?
Well, the Concerto Grosso came first and was actually a sort of outgrowth of the idea of having contrasting choirs that you would have, and they would contrast in terms of textures. And so you would have a little trio of 2 violins and a cello, as opposed to a string orchestra of a dozen people. And so you'd hear this interplay between these two textures, and that's what created the interest and drama, was in when you had this sort of dialogue between these two groups of instruments.
And when I listen to some of the early Concerti Grossi, sometimes it's more about, you're saying that call and response you hear in your left earphone. You hear one choir, and then in the right you hear the other. And sometimes the instruments you listen, it's kind of like, it's kind of hard to differentiate between some of these because they sound similar. But Johann Sebastian Bach and his Brandenburg concertos, I love these because the soloists are very, very different. Brandenburg Concerto No. 5, for instance, has harpsichord and violin and flute, very different sounding instruments as the soloist. And it's kind of like, seems like a game of catch, passing one solo line to the next and to the next.
Yeah, Bach took the Concerto Grosso concept to this completely different plane. And perhaps most remarkably, in the 5th Brandenburg Concerto, he came up with the idea of having a solo harpsichord. And up to this point, the harpsichord, was just the continuo instrument, was just the accompaniment. It was just part of the texture that let the other instruments shine. And so he came up with this very ingenious way of showcasing, of altering the texture so that the harpsichord itself could also be a solo instrument.
And the harpsichord in this concerto specifically has this incredible cadenza. And this seems also like an early time for cadenzas. As we'll see later on, they kind of become more standardized, how you get into them and how you get out of them. But what is happening here with the cadenza? Is it basically just everyone stops and then the soloist takes over and does their thing, kind of showing off, and then everyone comes back in at the end?
Well, first of all, before this, cadenzas existed in vocal music. They existed in arias. And Vivaldi kind of experimented with that in his violin concertos, but in terms of having this sort of formal place where the orchestra stops and then the solo instrument takes over with this incredible flight of fancy, and then with a little bit of a trill, comes back into the ripieno. Bach invented that in the Brandenburg Concerto No. 5. This is such a groundbreaking work in so many ways, and the way that he builds up the expectation is that at first the harpsichord doesn't even have the melody; it just gets more and more animated, while the flute and violin and orchestra have the melody, and it becomes busier and busier, and one by one the other instruments drop out, and then it has this absolutely incredible cadenza that must have had the force of, say, Jimi Hendrix playing guitar solo. It's so absolutely iconic and groundbreaking, and you sort of say, talk about, it's basically harpsichord hero at this point.
And I can imagine with this cadenza, this moment for the soloist to shine, and having something like this so incredible, it's easy to see why it would catch on after this, cadenzas being in so many concertos, in most concertos, because, at the end, the audience would have just gone wild.
And basically the entire rest of the 18th century takes Bach up on this challenge. And concerto, even more than the symphony, even more than really any other instrumental form, is what drives the development of orchestral music.
And speaking of the 18th century, as we get into the mid 1700s, thinking of the classical period, we start to get concertos that sound more familiar, I think because things become more standardized, a standard kind of set of musicians in an orchestra. And a lot of these are still played today. Before we're having, 6, 7 minute concertos to some bigger ones by Bach to now being pretty substantial works. And a great one, I think, to think about is Haydn's Cello Concerto Number 1, especially here as we see the cadenza form becoming more standardized, because cadenza and cadence, that's another word we can learn about. Those are very similar words, and I think that's on purpose, right?
Yeah, a cadence is I'm creating a cadence in my voice. I come to the end, but I come to there's a little bit of anticipation. Am I going to end? Am I going to just keep on going? Am I going to go into verbal flights of fancy before I finally come to the end? Yes, and that's it's a rhetorical device that comes not only from opera but also from oratory. Ministers do this. Preachers do this. And composers understood this, and that this created the drama for that one superstar instrumentalist to really shine.
And the cadence getting into the cadenza is, as you were just demonstrating, it's open-ended. It's kind of, it's not finished. And then, of course, the soloist comes into the spotlight. Towards the end of the cadenza is something that Bach did very, very quickly, kind of just flies by in the Fifth Brandenburg Concerto, and that is having a trill. It's kind of this, it adds suspension to the music, and it's this trill, which is basically two notes going back and forth between each other very quickly, that then leads into the downbeat with the orchestra coming back in. And that's almost universal in these concertos for this century and even the next, where you have this trill. So when you're at a concert, you'll see soloists doing their thing, and then they go higher and higher and higher and higher, and they do this nice little trill, and that's when you'll see a lot of musicians, they'll pick their instruments back up because they're about to come back in. Another big concerto from this time period, of course, Mozart wrote so many concertos. A big one, and I think a good one to demonstrate another idea, is his clarinet concerto. Of course, it's beautiful. And it also, I think, really clearly demonstrates the idea of what we call ritornello. And with the clarinet concerto, the opening theme is, it's so simple and it sticks with you so well. And you can kind of think of this opening theme, also we can call ritornello, as like the chorus in a song, right? It's something that comes back again and again and again throughout, for instance, the first movement. As it kind of comes back, it's also kind of is a good punctuation between moments and phrases for the soloist. They'll come in and they'll have their moment, but then of course they need a break, especially wind instruments, and having this ritornello, a returning theme, is also a good mental break and physical break for the soloist.
There's a sort of sense of always returning home. Ritornello is literally the same root as return. You get these little signposts, these sort of reminders of home, like you're not really home yet, but you sort of get there's, oh, yeah, that's the goal. That's where I'm going back to. And this is particularly poignant in the clarinet concerto, how Mozart uses the returns of themes in both the orchestra and the soloist.
And things are moving along. Concertos are getting bigger. They are getting longer, more in depth. And we're seeing a few instruments really becoming kind of stars, if you will, the piano, the violin, and also the cello. And we go into the early part of the Romantic period, the early 1800s into 1900. This seems like the height of the concerto in the Romantic period, where we have big star soloists like Clara Schumann and Joseph Joachim, and thinking of this being, a big part of the development of the orchestra and this music. I mean, these become as big, sometimes bigger than these huge symphonies that the composers would also write.
Well, what's interesting is the two main instruments that were used for the concerto were the violin and the piano. And they couldn't be more different in terms of there's an orchestra is 1/3 violins and an orchestra is 0% pianos. And so you have two completely different sets of challenges in each one of those kinds of concertos, sort of like, how do you make one violin sound special when there's 30 of them backing them up? And then the piano is just so different that the relationship becomes almost antagonistic, whereas the relationship between the violin is sort of like, well, how do you differentiate that? So it's, there's such tremendous challenges, and composers wanted to rise to that challenge because it created maximum drama, which is what you want from a concerto.
And up to this point, some of the aspects and the structure becomes standard with the concerto. And a composer who broke the mold in many different genres of classical music, Beethoven, did the same thing with these concertos. His violin concerto maybe follows a bit more with the previous ones, but his piano concertos, thinking also number 4 and 5 of his piano concertos, I mean, they start changing things big time.
In a way, the fifth concerto sort of takes the classical concerto to a new level of engagement between the soloist and orchestra, and brings it up to the level of this sort of heroic struggle, which is why it's called The Emperor. But it's in the fourth concerto that he really looks into the future about where the concerto was going to go in the late 19th century, as to not really so much being about this epic struggle so much as this kind of interesting coexistence where it's really all about the piano, but the orchestra creates this heightened space in which the soloist can exist. In the beginning of the fourth concerto, it's the piano that introduces the theme, which was never really done before.
Right, because we always hear these nice long introductions with the orchestra, and the soloist then comes in. With the fourth, as you're saying, the piano comes right in and it's the theme. And if I didn't know any better, when I just start listening to it, it's like, oh, it's a piano sonata.
Right, exactly. And so he plays with our expectations. And of course, in the concerts of Beethoven's time, it might have been a piano sonata, because he would do the kind of concerts they would give. They would have solo piano pieces and orchestral pieces on the same concert. And so, and in fact, he did that, on the same concert that the fourth was premiered. They had solo piano pieces. And so it was really a playing with the audience's expectations, a sort of blurring of lines of like, wait, when did the orchestra come in? What's going on here? And he created this new kind of drama, and where the soloist takes the lead and the orchestra follows, which was unheard of. As opposed to the fifth, where there's a huge introductory chord and then the piano comes in being a virtuoso, but still the hierarchy is established. It's the orchestra, and then the pianist is the soloist and the virtuoso, but not really the conductor like it is in the fourth. The soloist actually sort of becomes the conductor, or becomes the leader, becomes the sort of mind of the composer, which is a very different mindset, very different way of perspective from which to observe the drama of the conflict.
It's all those things, and bringing into even further into this time period with Saint-Saëns in 1872 with his cello concerto. It also gets rid of the introduction. I guess there's also a big chord, and then just right out of the gate, the cello is kind of explosive, but it sounds very different from the Emperor concerto opening, although it's kind of a similar idea of a big hit and then running off with a solo.
Well, in a way, the Saint-Saëns sort of combines both. You've got the explosive first note, but then the cello comes in with something that, in a way, it's a theme that could go either way. Is it an indulgent thing, or is it actual theme? And as we find out, it's an actual theme. And because Saint-Saëns didn't make those distinctions quite as clear-cut as Beethoven did. And so in the chansons, you get the cello driving the development, driving the, not only just sort of following in the footsteps of the orchestra, but driving every aspect of the musical argument of the piece from the beginning to the end. And it's also in what we call a cyclic form, in which themes from the first movement reappear in the third movement, and there's no real pause between movements. And so what 19th century composers were trying to do is have music sound more like an organic stream of consciousness and not this first movement, second movement, not this sort of formal classical thing. And Saint-Saëns really, really succeeded in doing that in this concerto.
And that's a big point where things are sometimes seamless. Movement 1 goes into 2, goes into 3, and it's not just, theme 1, theme 2. Okay, here's a little bit of, exploring different keys. But also with Saint-Saëns, I understand he's treating the orchestra versus soloist a bit different than composers before, of course, like Beethoven and Mozart and Haydn. Here, it's almost, I think I've heard you say that it's antagonistic against each other?
Well, yes. It's I wouldn't say antagonistic. It's more like the orchestra is. I mean, in the piano concertos, it became antagonistic. In the cello concerto, the cello can't really fight an orchestra. So the orchestra kind of, he cleverly orchestrates it so that the cello can feel like it's in the foreground. I mean, apparently in a letter, Saint-Saëns says that the cello concerto number 1 is about a storm, and you can certainly feel the idea that the first theme is very stormy, and the second movement sort of feels like a sort of lull. You can hear the little raindrops fall in the strings as the little. There's a nice little comforting melody, like, oh, we're getting a little eye in the storm. But then the storm comes back in the third movement, and then at the very end, turn to major, the sun comes out. And the cello carries all of that and that whole drama, so that it's like the cello is the human and the orchestra is the storm. And so in that sense, I suppose you could say it is antagonistic, but it's, there's certainly this very romantic idea of our being able to sort of project ourselves onto the soloist, even as the soloist is doing amazingly virtuosic things that we could never possibly do.
And the big difference is now the orchestra is able to do more things, be more things, play more roles, as opposed to the classical, nice, light, open, clean accompaniment. They're doing more driving, more pushing and pulling against the soloist.
Right, exactly. I mean, in a lot of these concertos, well, they add some really great colors, but it's also, when you play them on just cello and piano, you lose less than you would in some of these other classical concertos, because it's really all about the soloist.
And looking at a composer like Johannes Brahms and his violin concerto, of course, we still have these cadenzas, but of course, now that these works become so huge and sometimes so tremendously difficult, and the composer doesn't even play that instrument, Brahms, for instance, and his violin concerto, they're not really suited to write a cadenza for that instrument. So for his violin concerto, he asked violin virtuoso Joseph Joachim to write the actual cadenza for the piece.
Joseph Joachim was one of the many virtuosos who were as important to the development of the concerto as composers were themselves, because when a composer writes, he has to write for, if he's not a virtuoso himself, he has to write for someone else. And Joachim was tremendously influential in the 19th century. He was the person who could choose whether or not your concerto would be successful or not. By the time that he was around in the late 19th century, the Beethoven concerto had fallen out of favor a bit, but then he revised it and wrote his own cadenzas for it and became a hit again, and retained a popularity that remains to this day. And then when he inspired Brahms to write a concerto for him, he advised Brahms on how to make the part more violinistic, and he revised it heavily, and he also wrote cadenzas for that work. As a result, you have concertos more as collaborations, almost as much as, say, operas between a composer and a librettist. You had the composer and the person writing for who put his own stamp on the work that was unmistakable and was as important as in some ways as the composer himself.
Composers at this time definitely know, especially with concerts being big and open to the public, and there's all these critics and everything. I mean, if you don't play the instrument for the concerto, you seek out better advice like that of Joachim. And we can't leave the 19th century without mentioning, towards the very end, 1896, Dvorak and his cello concerto, because this one is obviously different. This one also to me just sounds so nostalgic, but the opening when the cello comes in, you're a cellist. How do you describe it?
Well, in a way, it's a throwback because you do have this huge orchestral introduction, and it sounds very much like it could be a symphony. And Dvorak is in no hurry. In fact, he's giving there's a beautiful horn solo. There's a beautiful oboe solo. There's no particular hint that the cello or anybody is going to be featured, and it's just this very, very dramatic introduction that's as portentous as in any of his symphonies, really. And you get this anticipatory feeling in the strings, and you don't know what's coming, and it's a cello, and it's a cello taking center stage. It's a cello being the hero, looking into the abyss, on the mountaintop. I don't think there's ever been such a dramatic way of setting up what a cello could be in all of music. It's so 19th century, and it's beyond nostalgia. It's kind of grief and love and preservation and sort of a last longing look at what was.
And looking now into the 20th century, we can see this kind of big arc with the concerto. Its early beginnings, it gets popular, especially with Haydn and Mozart. And in the 19th century, these are huge, larger-than-life works. And as we go into the 20th century, we start to see less concertos. That doesn't mean we have less music for soloist and orchestra, but as this form, it starts to kind of fall out of fashion a bit.
Yes, well, I think people expected more out of all symphonic music. There was sort of more pressure, especially as world events started to close in, like World War I and like advanced industrialization and the advent of recording. There was pressure on composers to write statements. And sometimes a composer would work that into a concerto, like Elgar did in his cello concerto, that was written at the end of World War I, that seems to be a statement upon that. But also, I think composers started to look beyond forms in general. And so they weren't confined to symphonies either. We have composers looking for other ways to juxtapose the soloist with the orchestra. And one example I can think of that also dates from World War I is The Lark Ascending by Ralph Vaughan Williams, in which he takes a poem by George Meredith talking about a bird winging in flight and casts the violin in the role of the bird. The juxtaposition of the soloist with this muted orchestra creates this magical effect that certainly is an outgrowth of the concerto development that happened so far, but it takes it to the next level. Like and Dvorak was all about the hero, and now the individual maybe isn't a hero. Maybe it's more like what the 20th century human condition, sort of like more like a sort of being looking around in confusion and despair and trying to hold on to hope. And you certainly hear all of that in The Lark Ascending.
And we still do have some concertos, and they seem to be big standout ones from composers like Sibelius and his violin concerto. I love the kind of characteristic sound that Sibelius has, but also just kind of the uber romantic and just infatuous sounds of Rachmaninoff, his second piano concerto. That's really just right at 1900, but also his third. Those are some of the most popular works from Rachmaninoff in general, but in a way I'm thankful that we have these kind of statement pieces that aren't concertos, the Lark Ascending, Rachmaninoff variations on a theme of Paganini, also Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue for piano and orchestra in its own arrangement. We have these, they still, if you go to a concert, they will kind of sit in the same place on the program as a concerto, so it's still that moment for soloist and orchestra, but now we get a variety of things. It's much more diverse in the sound and also in instruments.
Well, the concerto went into music in general went into lots of different directions. But what's interesting about Rachmaninoff is that he held on to the 19th century form longer than most. And, for a long time, this was considered sort of conservative or even reactionary. But I think now there's sort of a reassessment about what Rachmaninoff was actually doing, which is that if you really listen to them, he was inserting his own persona through the piano soloist. And so, he was as self-aware as anyone. And so the idea that he was creating these sort of almost cinematic landscapes of the soloist and orchestra, creating these complex emotions in bringing the concerto into the modern era. First of all, it created something that the 20th century audience could relate to and could find very accessible at that time. And it was also a way of sort of exploring, as I said, different kinds of emotions, more complex dynamics, and certainly unprecedented virtuosity, as Rachmaninoff was writing for his own incredible abilities, and for bigger and bigger pianos and bigger orchestras and bigger halls.
And we've talked about a lot of concertos. There's concertos for basically every instrument in the orchestra, from viola to bass, cello, violin, clarinet, bassoon, horn, trumpet, of course, trumpet very early on. The last instrument in the orchestra to get a concerto, the tuba, the first tuba concerto, 1956 by Ralph Vaughan Williams. This is also one I consider a kind of hidden gem. This is shorter, and as we mentioned a while ago, a lot of brass concertos, they're shorter just because out of
endurance.
Yeah, the endurance and the stamina is much less because, they're much smaller muscles in your lips. So I think if you've not heard the Vaughan Williams tuba concerto, which every tuba player have played it hundreds of times, I'm happy that I've played it with an orchestra. It's a tremendous experience going from the back of the stage to the very, very front of the stage, and that's a hidden gem. So on the show notes page, of course, we'll have lots of different recordings and videos of a lot of these concertos. This is one I think I would say, if you've not heard it, check it out. Do you have a kind of hidden gem concerto?
There's a concerto like Bloch Shlomo, which is a piece that I'm very fond of, in which the cello takes on a role, in this case, the role of King Solomon, sort of looking out at humanity, and you hear that the cello creates perhaps an even grander space than the Dvorak, an even more cosmic universe in this 20-minute work that creates this incredible journey.
So the concerto, and we've explored a lot here, from its early beginnings to its development and structure, from the classical period to the huge romantics to kind of its evolution into the 20th century. I think we've covered a lot here, and I would also say, if you've never heard a work for solo typewriter and orchestra, we'll have that on the show notes page as well. But thank you so much, James, for sharing your knowledge and experience here with the concerto.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I can talk for hours.
Thanks for listening to Classical Breakdown. If you want to hear some of the concertos we mentioned, visit the show notes page at classicalbreakdown.org. And if you have any comments or episode ideas, send me an email at classicalbreakdown@weta.org. I'm John Banther. Thanks for listening to Classical Breakdown from Classical WETA.